Let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled. This verse from Hebrews and the gospel today is what I would like to speak with you today about. When reading the gospel, I couldn't help but think of the movie A Man for All Seasons, a classic about the story of St. Thomas More. St. Thomas More and John the Baptist, I believe, have many commonalities. They're both liked and respected by the king. We see when Herodias wanted John dead, in verse 20 it says, Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and kept him safe. When he heard him, he was much perplexed, and yet he heard him gladly. We think of Thomas More, who was knighted by King Henry VIII and became his chancellor in 1529. Both St. Thomas More and John the Baptist defended the sanctity of marriage. We see in verse 17 to 18 of today's gospel, it says, Herod had sent and seized John and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because he had married her. For John said to Herod, It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. We think of St. Thomas More, who refused to sign a letter to the Pope requesting an annulment from Queen Catherine. Yet even the chancellor before him, Cardinal Wolsey, had done it. St. Thomas More also refused to go to the coronation ceremony of Queen Anne Boleyn after the king's self-granted annulment from Queen Catherine. Both of these things offended the king greatly. The part of the movie that always stands out to me for A Man of All Seasons is the scene in the courtroom after St. Thomas More has been convicted. He has this great line, which is very much taken from the original text of what he actually said, and I have it here written. More says, "The indictment is granted in an act of Parliament which is directly repugnant to the law of God and His holy Church, the supreme government over which no temporal person may by any law presume to take upon him. This was granted by the mouth of our Savior Christ himself to St. Peter and the bishops of Rome, whilst he lived and was personally present here on earth. It is therefore insufficient in law to charge any Christian to obey it." St. Thomas More defended the sanctity and sacramentality of marriage when the government was attacking it. Both were put in prison, and both, ironically, were beheaded. We see today society has very much attacked the sanctity and sacramentality of marriage. Some in society look at it as a way to manipulate the government. I was talking to a classmate of mine whose sister, when she was 17 years old, married a man in the military so that he could get better benefits. A lot of people don't believe there's a point in marriage. My cousin used to say, there's no point in me getting married, and really the only reason he married his now wife was for immigration purposes so she could get into the country, but he didn't see a point to marriage. I have another buddy named Dan who got married, and his boss gave him a lot of grief for asking for 3 days for a honeymoon off from work. And when he returned from his honeymoon, his boss laid him off. Some people look at marriage as an excuse for a party, a Vegas wedding, if you will. Marriage is no longer between one man and one woman, but we see gay marriage or polygamy in different areas of the world. Divorce rates are high. Some say that the church's teaching on marriage is too strict. These attacks can be hard for us Catholics to handle. We maybe know many people that fall into these categories where marriage or the fruit of marriage is under attack. We see that the fruit of marriage is under attack with things like contraception and abortion. Another person that is very similar to John the Baptist and to Thomas More in defending marriage would be Pope Paul VI, who defended the fruit of marriage in his document, Humani Vitae. Very much a controversial document for both those within the church and outside of the church. But he was defending the fruit of marriage. In section 17, he makes 3 predictions, and granted this is in 1968 that he makes these 3 predictions. And reading them today really shows that he was very much a prophet in his days, much like that of John the Baptist or St. Thomas More. He mentions the 3 effects of the artificial birth control. The first effect, he says, first consider how easily this course of action could open wide the way for marital infidelity and the general lowering of moral standards. And we see this today. The second effect, he says, is that a man grows accustomed to the use of contraceptive methods may forget the reverence due to a woman and reduce her to being a mere instrument for the satisfaction of his own desires. We see this in an increase in the use of pornography in our culture. We see this in the Me Too movement has very much emphasized and brought to light how women are abused and sexually assaulted all over the United States, but also the world. The third effect really stood out to me in reading Thomas More and thinking about Thomas More. It says, finally, careful consideration should be given to the danger of this power passing into the hands of those public authorities who care little for the precepts of the moral law. It could well happen, therefore, that when people, whether individually or in family or in social life, experience the inherent difficulties of the divine law and are determined to avoid them, they may give into the hands of public authorities the power to intervene in the most personal and intimate responsibility of husband and wife. The part that stood out to me was, experience the inherent difficulties of the divine law and are determined to avoid them. King Henry VIII experienced the difficulty of the divine law with marriage. John the Baptist experienced the difficulty that Herod had with marriage. And both of these kings were trying to avoid following the divine law. This third effect also really stands out to me when thinking about the HHS contraceptive mandate. A beautiful example of how the sacramentality and sanctity of marriage is held up reminds me of when Carola and Ralph got married a few weeks ago, and we got to go to that wedding. It was a very beautiful experience for me to see a couple who, although married for a long time outside the church, decided that they wanted their marriage blessed by the church. What a beautiful example. When we experience the inherent difficulties of the divine law surrounding the sanctity and sacramentality of marriage, do we become determined to avoid them? Or do we follow the examples of Carola and Ralph, Pope Paul VI, St. Thomas More, and John the Baptist, and defend the sanctity and sacramentality of marriage?